How did Germany finance one of the most devastating conflicts in human history? What drove the imperial government to rely so heavily on borrowing from its own people? And how did the financial decisions made between 1914 and 1918 not only fund a massive war machine, but also sow the seeds of economic catastrophe that would haunt Germany for decades? To understand the entire story of how Germany funded World War I through war bonds, from the first mobilization in August 1914 to the aftermath of defeat in 1918, we have to go back to the very beginning. In the late 19th century, the newly unified German Empire found itself in a peculiar financial position. Following the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, victorious Germany had extracted a massive indemnity from defeated France. 4 billion marks in reparations flowed into German coffers, and from this windfall, 120 million marks were set aside for a specific purpose. This was the Imperial War Chest, the Reichskriegsschatz. Since 1874, this war chest had been stored in a rather dramatic fashion. 1,200 sturdy wooden boxes, filled to the brim with German gold coins, sat in the old citadel in Spandau, now part of Berlin. The idea was straightforward. In the initial phase of any future military mobilization, this gold would pay for soldiers' maintenance, arms, ammunition, transport, and other immediate costs. It was Germany's emergency fund, sitting there gleaming in the darkness, waiting for the day it would be needed. But the architects of German financial policy knew that gold alone wouldn't be enough. As early as 1891, officials from the Imperial Treasury, the Prussian Finance Ministry, and the Reichsbank had gathered to discuss a comprehensive plan for war finance. They understood that modern warfare would be expensive, far more expensive than anything seen before. The solution they devised was elegant in its simplicity. Germany would finance any future war through a combination of short-term credit and long-term loans. The gold in Spandau would be transferred to the Reichsbank to bolster its reserves, and from there, the central bank would provide short-term credit to the government. This plan evolved over the following decades. By 1913, as tensions mounted across Europe and another expensive armament program got underway, the imperial war chest was increased by another 120 million marks. Additionally, the government accumulated a cash reserve of 120 million marks in silver coins. Germany believed it was ready. Its financial mobilization plan was in place, refined over more than 2 decades of careful preparation. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914, financial markets across Europe went into turmoil. The declarations of war that followed created 2 immediate challenges for all the belligerent powers. First, they needed to prevent a run on the gold reserves of their central banks. Second, they had to provide liquidity to their economies given the sudden interruption to foreign trade and investment. Germany moved swiftly. On August 4, 1914, as German armies swept into Belgium, the Imperial Diet, the Reichstag, voted unanimously on a package of laws that had been prepared for exactly this moment. The government was authorized to contract credits up to 5 billion marks to finance the war, a limit that could be extended if necessary, and it would prove very necessary indeed. The cornerstone of Germany's wartime financial strategy was already in motion. First, the Reichsbank suspended the convertibility of paper money into gold. Before the war, Germany had been on the gold standard, with 2,790 marks equal to 1 kilogram of pure gold. Now that link was severed. The papier mark, paper money backed only by government promise, became the only currency in circulation. This decision was driven by the exigencies of war, but it marked a profound departure from the principles of sound money. Second, new financial instruments were introduced. Treasury bills, short-term government paper that could be bought by the Reichsbank itself or by Germany's private financial institutions, became the means by which the government would raise immediate cash. These bills would be continuously floated, providing a steady stream of funding. Third, Special loan banks were established to provide credits to businesses, states, and local authorities, freeing the central bank to concentrate on imperial government finance. These loan banks issued their own money, loan bank notes, which were declared admissible as primary reserves. It was an intricate system designed to keep money flowing through the German economy even as resources were redirected toward the war effort. But the real centerpiece of German war finance, the mechanism that would ultimately raise the vast majority of funds, was about to be unveiled. In September 1914, just weeks after the war began, Germany issued its first war loan. The interest rate was set at 5%, relatively high compared to pre-war government bonds. This was by design. The bonds needed to be attractive enough to convince Germans to part with their money. Commercial banks, savings banks, and credit cooperatives all offered the bonds for subscription. The government made it easy for people to participate. Savings banks allowed their customers to withdraw their savings without notice to purchase war bonds. Loan banks accepted the bonds as collateral for credits. And then there was the propaganda. A vast campaign accompanied the first war loan. Newspaper reports suggested that individuals who didn't subscribe might later regret it. The interest rate was attractive, they said, and since victory was near, this might be the only war bond that would be issued. The message was clear. This was a safe investment. This was a patriotic duty. This was your chance to help Germany win the war. The response was remarkable. There were 1,200,000 subscriptions and the government received 4.5 billion marks. By previous standards, this was an enormous success. But it was only the beginning. The strategy that emerged was straightforward. To raise immediate cash, the central government would continuously float short-term bills bought either by the Reichsbank itself or by Germany's private financial institutions. Then, each fall and spring, the government would issue a long-term war loan to the general public and use the proceeds to pay down its floating short-term debt. These war loans would come to be known as Kriegsanleihen. 9 times over the course of the war, Germany would launch these massive bond drives. Like Austria-Hungary, which followed a similar model, the loans were issued at 6-month intervals. The drives themselves would last several weeks, during which there was extensive use of propaganda via all possible media. Most bonds had a rate of return of 5% and were redeemable over a 10-year period in semi-annual payments. To make them accessible, they were sold through banks, post offices, and other financial institutions. Like war bonds in other countries, the German drives were designed to be extravagant displays of patriotism. The second war loan came in February 1915. By this point, the cumulated government debt had become huge by previous standards. In July 1915, the new Secretary of the Treasury, Karl Helfferich, invited the finance ministers of the states to a conference on war finance. Helfferich was an economist by training, a man who believed he understood the levers of financial power. He still assumed the war would end with a German victory, probably before the end of the year, or at the latest after the winter of 1915 to 1916. His message was optimistic. Tax increases were not necessary, he asserted. War expenditure could be financed with the combination of short-term credits and loans. But there was a catch. After the war, the repayment of the public debt would pose a serious problem. Helfferich estimated that by the end of the conflict, Germany would accumulate a debt of perhaps 60 to 70 billion marks. And here was the crucial assumption that underlay the entire strategy. Germany expected to win. Just as it had imposed reparations on France after 1871, a victorious Germany would levy an indemnity on its vanquished opponents. The war bonds would be paid off with the enemy's money. This was the grand strategy pursued by Helfferich, Reichsbank President Rudolf Havenstein, and later Finance Minister Siegfried von Roedern. Fund the extraordinary budget through war loans to the German public, win the war, and use the indemnity to pay everything back. It was a gamble on victory. The propaganda for the early war loans reflected this confidence. The campaigns emphasized the certainty of German victory and the safety of the investment. Subscribers were told they were not just lending money, they were contributing to a cause that would be repaid with interest from a defeated enemy. This was patriotism that paid. The groundwork for Germany to maintain financial readiness for war was to finance the conflict with war bonds, and the imperial government employed a sophisticated propaganda apparatus to make it work. The campaigns had two main thrusts. On one hand, they advertised the financial benefits of war bonds as safe and attractive investments. On the other, they tried to appeal to citizens' patriotic feelings, promoting war bonds as a contribution that was to be rendered by all Germans to ensure a German victory. Until 1917, the Reichsbank and the Treasury had not employed catchphrases or images to advertise war bonds. They considered methods linked to political propaganda and advertising as crude and unsuitable for their purpose. Instead, they successfully advertised through text posters and prominent figures acting as disseminators of information. But when the Fifth War Loan in September 1916 proved less successful than its predecessor, the propaganda efforts shifted dramatically. The campaigns began to address a wider section of society by using visual and film material. Posters appeared everywhere, depicting determined, heroic soldiers who relied on the home front's financial support. These images promoted the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, stressing the necessary unity of front and home front. They highlighted the need to persevere against adversity. The visual propaganda often bore little resemblance to the actual warfare being waged. One poster depicted a medieval knight marching through a hail of arrows as if the trenches of the Western Front were some noble crusade from centuries past. The text read simply, "Comrades, subscribe to the Seventh War Loan." The visualization of Germany's economic strength placed specific emphasis on different aspects, such as the chemical industry, which was supposed to shed a better light on Germany compared to its enemies. Advertisements provided alleged objective information about public spending on education and social security both by Germany and by the enemy. The promotion of economic stability could be combined with a nationalistic polemic. One way of advertising was to demonstrate that military success was a foregone conclusion and thereby war bonds were seen as a secure investment. This method was still being used in autumn 1918 when the Ninth War Bond was launched, even as defeat loomed on the horizon. No one was spared from the propaganda. Even school children were targeted to get involved in subscribing to collective war bonds, so-called school war bonds, and to design their own promotional material. One surviving example shows a subscription and honorary card for the Fifth War Bond, drawn by a 16-year-old. Children were pictured in war bond propaganda, their innocent faces used to shame adults into contributing. Women featured prominently in the campaigns as well, depicted as supporters of the war efforts, their role to encourage their husbands, fathers, and sons to buy bonds. The propaganda was designed to reach every segment of German society, to make everyone feel they had a stake in the war and a duty to contribute. Musical rhymes were created to highlight the need for war bonds in a playful way. One song went, "Infantry in the trench must be equipped with rifle and bullet, and a man's courage is of no use when he cannot fire his weapon." Another verse declared, "When the sailor in a submarine shoots the torpedo towards the enemy, he is aware that such a shot must be expensive." The campaigns emphasized that households and corporations should invest all their liquid reserves in war bonds. To enhance placement, the formerly long-term war loans were made into flexible investments. Each war loan consisted not only of long-term bonds of 10 years maturity, but also of medium-term treasury certificates of 5 years maturity. The number of subscriptions for the war loans grew impressively. From 1.2 million for the first loan in September 1914, the figures climbed to a maximum of 7.1 million for the sixth loan in March 1917. Compared with the number of households in Germany, which had been about 14 million in 1910, this was an extraordinary participation rate. People who had never before bought securities were investing their savings in war loans. By this measure, the war bond program was a stunning success. Germany's 9 war bonds generated a total of 97 billion marks, or by some calculations, 98 billion marks. To put this in perspective, this represented about 85% of Germany's overall war costs. Nearly all circles of the population subscribed to these war loans through 1918, reflecting the success of the loan publicity and the confidence the population placed in their nation's financial authorities. But the aggregate numbers masked important details. In spite of the wide distribution of war bonds, most of the financial contribution came from investors at the top of the income and wealth pyramid. For statistical purposes, the subscriptions for all 9 war loans can be divided into 3 classes: a lower class of amounts up to 1,000 marks, a middle class from 1,100 to 100,000 marks, and an upper class of 100,000, 100 marks, and more. The wealthy were carrying the bulk of the burden, as they had the most to invest. But the propaganda had succeeded in creating the image of a unified national effort, with Germans from all walks of life contributing what they could. Many people bought war bonds without even knowing it. Savings banks' deposits increased considerably during the war, and the savings banks invested a large part of their funds in war loans. This meant that ordinary Germans who simply deposited money in their savings accounts were indirectly financing the war through their bank's investment decisions. As the war dragged on and the debt increased rapidly, the public apparently began to lose confidence in the promise of reparations. When the Fourth War Loan was launched in March 1916, Secretary Helfferich notably did not mention that the public debt would be paid back with reparations. Instead, he declared that repayment of the loan was guaranteed by the strength of the German economy. The focus of the propaganda changed. The Reichsbank emphasized in its campaign for the Sixth War Loan in March 1917 that Germany's national wealth and national income were large enough to guarantee the public debt. Reparations would not be needed for repayment. This was a significant shift in messaging, though it went largely unnoticed amid the ongoing propaganda barrage. The truth was becoming harder to hide. Victory was not coming as quickly as promised. The costs kept mounting, and while the war bonds kept selling, the financial situation was becoming increasingly precarious. Germany's main financial problem was not the war bonds themselves, but what happened in between the bond drives. Despite the popularity of its war loans, by the end of 1916, the German government was spending significantly more than it was taking in, either through its long-term loans or through taxation. After 1916, the federal government's short-term floating debt grew relentlessly. By the end of the war, it accounted for over 30% of the federal government's total debt. This situation created the potential for serious inflation. Any short-term debt not purchased by German banks or placed in the Berlin money market had to be bought by the Reichsbank, which printed new paper money to do so. This is where critical differences began to appear between Germany's war finance and those of its Western foes. Both Great Britain and France had deep money markets, Britain in particular, which were willing and able to buy short or medium-term government bills in large quantities. Germany's money markets were less developed. When German banks couldn't absorb all the short-term debt, the Reichsbank had to step in, and that meant printing money. The explosion of public spending was driven in part by the Hindenburg Program, Germany's massive armament campaign launched in 1916. The program was named after Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, who by this point had been elevated to almost mythical status in German propaganda. But the program's ambitions far outstripped Germany's ability to pay for it without resorting to the printing press. To combat the perception of financial weakness and maintain confidence in the currency, Helfferich and Havenstein pursued an aggressive publicity campaign. They convinced the German public to hand their gold over to the Reichsbank to augment its reserves and to place their trust in Germany's paper currency. By the end of 1916, virtually no specie remained in circulation. The population had patriotically surrendered their gold coins, trading them for paper marks. The gold reserve at the Reichsbank, which had been 1.6 billion marks in June 1914, increased to a maximum of 2.6 billion marks in 1917. But even this accumulation of gold was not enough to cover the vast expansion of paper money. After 1916, the Reichsbank relied increasingly on loan bureau notes to circumvent the gold ratio while maintaining the impression that Germany's paper currency was still backed by specie. By the end of the war, the amount of money in circulation had risen fourfold, and prices had increased by some 140%. Yet at this stage, the German mark had suffered no more than the British pound, was somewhat weaker than the American dollar, but stronger than the French franc. The inflation was concerning, but it was not yet catastrophic. Since the seventh loan in September 1917, acceptance of the war loans had been declining. The number of subscriptions dropped from the peak of 7.1 million for the sixth loan to lower levels. The autumn 1916 issue, the fifth war bond, had already seen a decline from 5.2 million subscribers to 3.8 million. People were growing weary, skeptical, perhaps sensing that the promises might not be kept. But the campaigns continued. The ninth and final war loan was issued in September 1918. Just 2 months before the armistice, with defeat imminent, the German government was still trying to raise money from its exhausted population. The propaganda machinery ground on, still claiming that victory was assured, that the investment was safe, that every good German had a duty to subscribe. It was only with this ninth loan that the volume decreased significantly to 10.4 billion marks. By this point, the game was nearly up. The German armies were in retreat. The home front was crumbling. And yet the propaganda posters still depicted noble warriors and promised security. The explanation for the success of the war loans throughout most of the war may lie in the lack of alternatives. Nominal incomes increased during the war, but consumption, as well as investment for non-military production, were curtailed by the planning system. There were few options for households or corporations to invest their savings. The alternatives to war bonds were savings accounts, short-term government paper, or simply cash holdings. For many Germans, war bonds seemed like the best available option, even as doubts crept in. It's worth understanding how Germany's financing compared to its adversaries. Britain, France, and Germany all relied more on debt than taxation to fund their war expenditures. But there were crucial differences in how they managed this debt. Britain and France had significantly more developed money markets and were able to access foreign loans, particularly from the United States, before it entered the war. The Entente powers sold off privately owned foreign assets and took out loans in New York to finance their trade deficits. Before its entry into the war, money markets in the United States lent over $2 billion to the Entente, compared to only between $27 and $35 million to the Central Powers. Germany found itself largely excluded from international financial markets. An attempt to float a major loan on Wall Street failed in 1914. As such, Germany was limited to domestic borrowing. This meant Germany couldn't access the foreign resources and war material from beyond its borders to the extent possible for the Entente. Germany's trade deficit during the war was substantial. German exports from August 1914 to December 1918 amounted to only 17 billion marks, while imports totaled 32 billion marks. In addition to its own trade deficit of 15 billion marks, Germany also financed import surpluses of its allies totaling 5 billion marks. This total deficit of 20 billion marks was financed through gold transfers, sales of securities on neutral markets, and further borrowing. One of the most consequential decisions of German war finance was the reluctance to raise taxes substantially. At first, German financial authorities like Helfrich decided not to pursue higher taxation in the belief that the war would be short. When it became clear that victory would be a long time coming, new leadership at the Treasury tried to increase taxation to cover the costs of war. Finance Minister von Rodern introduced a tax on war profits in June 1916, and later a turnover tax and a coal tax. But these measures were too little, too late. In comparison, the United States and Great Britain covered about 1/4 of their World War I costs through tax increases. In Austria, the contribution made by taxes to financing war expenditure was essentially zero. Germany fell somewhere in between, but its reliance on borrowing far exceeded its use of taxation. Raising taxes during wartime is always unpopular. Governments fear political backlash, social unrest, and the potential loss of public support for the war effort. The German government preferred to borrow, to push the costs into the future, to gamble that victory would solve all financial problems. But this decision to avoid substantial tax increases meant that when defeat came, the entire burden of the debt would fall on a defeated and impoverished population. When the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, Germany faced a catastrophic financial situation. The government had accumulated a massive debt, much of it held by its own citizens in the form of war bonds. The expected indemnity from defeated enemies would never materialize. Instead, Germany would be the one paying reparations. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, assigned sole blame for the war on the Central Powers through the infamous War Guilt Clause. It imposed large and uncertain reparations on Germany, initially set at 132 billion gold marks. The treaty specified that Germany had to make payments in gold-backed currency or foreign currency, making the debt inflation-proof. Meanwhile, the domestic debts owed from the war, including all those war bonds, were listed in paper marks. This created a perverse incentive. If the mark lost value through inflation, the real burden of the domestic debt would decline, even as the foreign reparations debt remained fixed. The Republican government, established in Berlin on November 9, 1918, faced a nearly impossible task. Military expenditure decreased sharply, but this did not mean a return to the pre-war situation. There were new responsibilities with new expenses: pensions for disabled soldiers, widows, and orphans, subsidies for businesses to support the transition from war production to peacetime economy, and above all, the reparations that the Allies were demanding. Throughout 1919 and into the early 1920s, German officials and economists engaged in fierce debates about the causes of the country's financial troubles. Many, including Karl Helfferich himself, argued that the hyperinflation was due to the impossibility of paying the reparations imposed by Versailles. They claimed the problem was not domestic financial policy, but the unbearable external burden. But historians have since recognized that the roots of Germany's post-war inflation lay in the war finance policies themselves. The way Germany funded its war effort, the excessive reliance on printing money to cover short-term debt, the lack of proper taxation, all created the conditions for inflation. The reparations and the political turmoil of the Weimar Republic certainly exacerbated the problem, but they did not create it from nothing. The Reichsbank continued to print money to meet the government's needs. The discount rate, the interest rate at which the central bank lent to commercial banks, remained unchanged at 5% from summer 1914 until July 1922. Even as prices spiraled upward, President Havenstein was convinced the central bank was following a restrictive policy and categorically denied that it had inflated the currency. Between December 1921 and July 1922, the amount of domestic bills and checks held by the Reichsbank rose by 616%, from 922 million marks to 6.6 billion. By May 1922, just 21% of the government's income came from taxes. The rest came from selling treasury bills to the Reichsbank in return for newly printed marks. In January 1923, France and Belgium occupied Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr, in response to non-payment of reparations. This was a grave economic blow, compounded by the Berlin government covering the wages of workers idled in a campaign of non-cooperation with the occupation. The treasury increasingly turned to the central bank. Apart from the state printing office, 130 other printers were producing marks, sometimes printing only one side to save time and cost. By late 1923, Germany's real income was barely half that of 1913. Bread riots broke out. The value of the mark against the US dollar, which had been 4.2 marks per dollar in 1914, collapsed to 4.2 billion per dollar by November 20th, 1923. 5 years after the armistice, the Reichsbank had issued 496.5 quintillion marks, each of which had fallen to 1/1,000,000th of its 1914 gold value. The war bonds, those certificates that millions of Germans had purchased with patriotic fervor and hopes of profit, became worthless. Life savings evaporated. The middle class was devastated. Those who had lent money to the government to finance the war lost everything. Those who had borrowed, particularly large landowners and industrialists, saw their debts liquidated by inflation. The hyperinflation finally ended in November 1923 through drastic measures. A new government under Gustav Stresemann took office with dictatorial powers. It announced plans to improve tax collections and cut spending by dismissing a quarter of government employees over 4 years. Most importantly, a new currency was introduced. The Rentenmark, backed by mortgage bonds indexed to the market price of gold, went into circulation on November 15, 1923. The Reichsbank was forbidden from discounting any further government treasury bills. Hjalmar Schacht, who had been appointed currency commissioner, promptly turned off the printing presses. 12 zeros were cut from prices, and the prices quoted in the new currency remained stable. The hyperinflation was over, but the damage was done. An entire generation of Germans had seen their savings destroyed, their faith in the government and the financial system shattered. The social and political consequences would reverberate for years to come.